Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are tuning in from. We are so excited to have you today. We are also very excited to have RJ Friedman with us, and he's going to be presenting for you on the ever important topic of cybersecurity, and more specifically, how attackers can gain access to your network. RJ is Buchanan's Chief Information Security Officer and Managed Security Services Leader. In this role, he is responsible for all internal security practices, as well as the delivery of our managed security services to our clients. Prior to joining Buchanan, RJ owned and operated Day One Cyber, an award-winning MSSP that delivered advanced holistic cybersecurity services. Before we jump into the webinar, I do have a couple of housekeeping items that I just want to cover really quickly. All attendees are automatically muted, but if you have a question or a thought come through during the presentation, we do encourage you to submit that through the chat box on your screen. I believe it's right under the video player. And time permitting, we will do a Q&A session at the end of the presentation that is kind of touching on some of the most popular questions we received throughout the presentation. Please note that if your question is not addressed, a representative from Buchanan will be in touch shortly after the webinar to get you the information that you need. I also want to point out that we have uploaded some relevant documents and resources, and we really do encourage you to download those, as they will, it's really relevant to what RJ is going to be covering for us today. So I think that's everything on my end. With that, I will turn it over to you, RJ.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Ellie. I'm excited to be here. And so as we all know, right, cyber attacks are on the rise. I won't beat a dead horse because everyone's heard it plenty over the past year, but COVID has made things more interesting for our profession, to say the least. So nearly 70% of business leaders feel their cybersecurity risks are increasing, according to Accenture. That's understandable considering the current cyber threat landscape. During this presentation, I'm going to go over the 9 different ways that MITRE framework says that an attacker can gain access to your environment. And at the end of the presentation, I will go over mitigation and detection techniques for each of those steps. That's the fun part. This presentation should be interesting and beneficial for everyone from IT and business leaders to CISOs and SOC operators, although, of course, the initial access category is one of the more basic concepts of the attack framework. So first, what is MITRE and what is MITRE ATT&CK? MITRE is a nonprofit organization that was put up to help federal government run federally funded research programs. I think it was about 40 years ago or so. Cybersecurity is one of the areas that they research, and ATT&CK is a knowledge base. You're looking at it here. It's a knowledge base and security framework which documents adversary tactics and techniques. Of course, by adversaries, I mean cyber criminals, but also red team. The framework is a collaborative effort, and dozens of companies have contributed to it based on their real-world observations. So everything that is in ATT&CK is from real-world experience. It was first introduced in 2014 with the goal of helping defenders understand how attackers think and operate. The idea there is that if you know how your enemy thinks, then you're better able to defend against them. It's currently in version 9, so it's been around for a while now. I think 2014 is when it first came out. MITRE also has done 3 technical assessments of EDR products called the MITRE ATT&CK evaluation, where they judge defensive and discovery tools by how well they detect various methods within the attack framework. We'll likely have a separate webinar on that topic in the future, especially since the new evaluation just came out and there's a lot of data there to digest. To get us started today, I'm going to speak to the 9 initial access techniques. As you may or may not know, initial access is not the first category by MITRE. As you can see, well, actually you can't see on this tab here, but it's not the first category by MITRE. And although with some very limited exceptions, it really is the first place that you can start taking the fight to the adversary, where you can start taking action against your adversary. and start fighting back. Thus, it's a great place to start our series. So what is initial access? Well, put very simply, initial access is when an adversary is trying to gain access into your network or does so. The category consists of 9 different techniques and multiple subtechniques. So I am going to discuss these 9 initial access techniques in what is my opinion, the correct order of magnitude. The first few will take a significant chunk of time to get through, but considering these techniques account for the majority of attacks, I think it's time well spent. After we get through all of them, I'll go through and share some best practices around detection and remediation, which you can start putting in place today to mitigate these risks. And you'll also notice that there are some icons placed on the various slides throughout. Pay attention to those as they'll come into play at the end of the charts that we have. All right, well, let's start with perhaps the most well-known hacking technique that exists today, phishing, or some sort of phishing, is used in over 80% of successful attacks. Over 80% of attacks involve phishing. So what is it? Well, it's when an attacker pretends to be someone that they aren't in order to gain sensitive information that can help them progress their attack against an organization or individual. There's some sub-techniques of phishing, including spearfishing attachments, spearfishing links, and spearfishing via a service, which we'll dive into here. I'm sure many of you have gotten emails and texts and even phone calls pretending to be your CEO or your wife or your best friend. They're trying to get some information from you that can help the attacker gain further access. A lot of those details, your wife, who your boss is, who your best friend is, you have it on social media, you have it on LinkedIn, you have it on Facebook, and the attackers, go and add you or stalk you on there, as we put it, and figure out that information so that they know who to pretend to be. So, for example, someone who got access to your Facebook page, which isn't private, reaches out, sends an email pretending to be your wife, saying something like, "Hey, honey, remind me what the last 4 digits of your social security number are for this credit card I'm getting for us." And you may laugh, but you'd actually be surprised that something that simple works a lot of the time. And by a lot, I mean one of our security awareness training partners, KnowBe4, estimates that about 40% of people fall for phishing attacks when not trained to spot them. And that number definitely correlates to the numbers that we see with our clients when they are first onboarded as well. Phishing can get very sophisticated, fooling some of the best of us, and that's where we start to get into some of the sub-techniques. So a spearfishing attachment, again, spearfishing is really when they're targeting you. Phishing is more where they're sending out an email to thousands of people. Spearfishing is when they've gone and they've looked you up, they know who to pretend to be based on who you are, what you do. So in the spearfishing attachment scenario, this is when someone has targeted you. Let's say you're in finance for this scenario. You might say something like, "Hey, Dave from finance, I've attached a huge check, and you need to cash it in right now or it'll expire," right? Putting urgency on it. That file could be a PDF or another Office document, and it'll usually contain some sort of Visual Basic script, which then connects the attacker to your system and gets your system to connect to the C2 or command and control server. That is then kind of the staging area for where the attacker gains a foothold into your organization and expands their reach. Remember, that's the whole point of attackers doing this, right? It's just for them to get further into your organization so that they can do whatever it is that they're trying to do. A procedural example, we're actually on that slide here, and there's many, as lots of very large attacks have included this type of technique, is APT28, or more famously known as Fancy Bear. This group used spearfishing to compromise Hillary Clinton and the DNC. And Fancy Bear, of course, is part of Russia's GRU, a special unit, kind of like our NSA. In this example, Fancy Bear is using a spearfishing document targeting cybersecurity experts who attended a conference in DC. A little brazen, right? They're actually going after people in our industry by pretending to send out information about a cybersecurity conference. This page that you're looking at is an exact replica of the document on the conference homepage. But when you look a little bit deeper here, on the left, you've got the Visual Basic script that's behind the scenes with a macro within the document. Once the user interacts with it, this code runs. And not to get too deep into it, but it's essentially pulling base64 encoded text out of the various properties on the right side that you see there, subject, categories, et cetera, and initiates contact with the attacker's C2 server. As you can see, when the attacker puts the code into the subject category, all those different areas there, that code is pulled out and read, and that's what sends the user's computer to connect to various servers. So the next sub-technique of phishing is a spearfishing link. And this here operates almost identically as an attachment, except of course, right, it's a link. As you can see in this example email, the attacker is pretending to be our IT department and is encouraging me to click on a link to a VPN portal. That link does not go to our VPN portal. It goes to an attacker's web page. This is what it could look like. This might look very familiar to everyone here that uses Office 365 because it is identical to your login page for 365. Alternatively, the landing page may contain a download, rely on other initial access techniques such as a drive-by compromise, which we'll get into soon. Lastly, though, we have spear phishing via a service. And this is an interesting one. This could happen if someone gains control of an application that they shouldn't have control of, like IT support application, where they're able to, send you a message through a channel you wouldn't expect. It could also be when they use an application that you use, like LinkedIn. This example here is when Fin6, which is an attack group, used the technique by placing fake job ads on LinkedIn. They're putting fake job ads out there so that people looking for jobs would reach out and engage. As you can see in this example, the form that they sent out looks a lot like a real job form. However, it was sent in a zip file with other malicious programs and codes. All right. Next up, we'll talk about valid accounts. So what are valid accounts? Essentially, anytime an organization is hacked over the years, let's say LinkedIn in 2014, I think it's 14, most of you probably had an account back then. And with this attack, attackers may have actually gotten access to your username and password that you used. This gave them a starting point for a technique called password spraying, where they took actual credentials and put it into systems that you might use. If you reuse your username and password from LinkedIn, or if you regularly use your dog's name, your son's birthday as your password for multiple accounts, that opens you up to this technique where attackers can gain valid access to your account through credentials because they've used a legitimate username and password. With this info, they can gain varied levels of access to your organization depending on who you are and the access that you have. Hopefully, it's very minimal, right? One of the controls we'll talk about. A really great example of this is the big Twitter hack that just happened in the last year. This was when 140 famous people from Joe Biden to Elon Musk had their Twitter accounts compromised. And the attack actually used a variety of initial access techniques. It's pretty common. This particular example not only used phishing, but also a valid account technique. So they spearphished an engineer, got his login info, and then they used that valid account, which was an admin account, to gain access to the back end of Twitter, where they compromised various feeds. It's important to note this one in particular, because in this situation, these guys could have actually started a war, right? They had government officials, very high-ranking government officials that they had hacked. They could have crashed the stock market. They could have done a ton of very, very bad things. I think luckily for all of us, these guys were pretty amateur, even though they were able to hack one of the theoretically most secure orgs out there, one of the biggest and richest, right? Should be pretty hard to hack, but these guys were pretty amateur. They only tried to get people to go to their very obvious cryptocurrency address in order to send them money. I think they got, I don't know, less than $100,000 or something from it, but they still got money, which is interesting. So there's 4 sub-techniques of valid accounts. All this really entails is classifying the 4 separate types of accounts that can be compromised. That includes default account, domain account, local account, and cloud account. Those are all pretty straightforward, so I won't dive too deep into them today. But as you know, certain types of accounts have elevated levels of access and thus should be better protected. Okay, so next up is supply chain compromise. Supply chain compromise is something that's been getting a little more attention recently. You all may have seen it with Huawei, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but there have been a variety of other organizations that may not have hit the news that have been compromised with this type of attack also. Supply chain compromise is where an adversary manipulates either a product or a delivery mechanism prior to receipt by a final customer for the purpose of either data or system compromise. As an example of this, SolarWinds. So SolarWinds arguably was if not the largest, one of the most impactful attacks of all time. We're going to be seeing the repercussions for that for a while because through SolarWinds, they attacked a lot of other government agencies as well as cybersecurity providers too. The attackers used a couple of initial access techniques to get into SolarWinds itself. Once they were in, they were able to access the code of the software that was being sold to customers. They proceeded to program in various methods to expand their reach within those customer organizations with that access. So essentially, when these customers installed and ran SolarWinds software, they unknowingly were running malware. The attackers turned real, legitimate software into malware. That's a supply chain compromise. On the hardware side of things, companies like Huawei had their product intercepted by the Chinese government, who actually put additional chips on the hardware. These chips collected data back to China and were able to compromise a whole bunch of companies that installed the hardware all throughout the U.S. to the point where the U.S. government banned the sale of the hardware or the purchase of the hardware to certain entities. With these 2 examples, we've actually touched on 2 of the 3 sub-techniques of supply chain compromise, software and hardware, but there's a third. It's called software dependencies and development tools. This is where an adversary might manipulate software and dev tools prior to receipt by a customer. So, for example, there are a lot of open source tools that are used in software development, and if someone went and compromised one of those software development tools, then they can theoretically compromise everything the tool is used to create or that it interacts with. Hardware edition is actually a separate technique from supply chain compromise. A hardware edition isn't an attack on your supply chain, but rather an attack on your physical security. And it happens when an attacker can physically gain access to your environment. An example of this is when, let's say, someone tailgates one of your employees into your organization. They walk around and plug a few USBs in and leave. That hardware edition of the USB device can actually cause some serious damage. So there are a lot of different commercial and open source products and tactics that can be leveraged with this type of attack, which can further compromise your organization. Password network tapping, man in the middle, or even adding in a new wireless access point to an existing network. Similar to hardware edition is replication through removable media. And in this case, the attacker isn't really getting into your physical environment, but instead will rely on one of your employees to let them into your physical environment. One very common way of doing this, and it works just about every time we try it, is putting USBs in your company parking lot. Someone will inevitably pick it up and plug it in, and unless you have the proper controls in place, that USB will auto-run and launch malicious applications. Next up is a drive-by compromise, and this is a sneaky one. Let's say you go to a website like Forbes.com. You're not expecting that the advertisements being served to you are actually hiding malware in them. But because of a vulnerability in JavaScript that was exploited, attackers were able to get into the back end of Forbes, or I think it was their advertising agency. They manipulated the ads, put malicious code in the actual ads so that they were hosting malware. And everyone that went to Forbes and had a certain version of a browser was compromised. That's a drive-by compromise. All right. Now, external remote services. So this is actually one of the ones that you see the most in movies, although in real life, it is actually not as common, right? You would think that it's every attack is a very technical attack, but really it's a lot less common, although it does happen. And we see every month new companies coming out and patching their tools because of vulnerabilities that are found. Anyway, a remote service is something like a VPN or Citrix or another access mechanism that allows your user to connect to an internal enterprise network from external locations. Oftentimes, a remote gateway is utilized that's responsible for managing those connections, and credentialed authentication is used as well. And so one way that an attacker can gain access with the external remote services is when someone goes to use one of them, and oftentimes there's a direct overlap with this attack method and valid account technique that we talked about earlier. Although there are times when, of course, the attackers can go in without a valid account, and again, they're utilizing vulnerabilities found in the tools themselves. So, if the attackers aren't using a valid account, this tends to be a more technical attack. And this technique has actually become a little bit more prominent over the past year or so, especially as a lot of people went to a work from home scenario. They've left a lot of misconfigured RDP ports enabled, leaving them accessible from all over the world. And for example, just before this webinar here, we went on and pulled the screenshot from Shodan.io. If you guys aren't familiar, Shodan's a website that hackers can use for threat intelligence or for gathering intelligence on you, rather. And we can also use them as defenders, right? We can use the website to see exposure of our organization. This screenshot is showing that we found 847 open RDP ports here in Austin, Texas alone, right here in my backyard. 847 RDP ports open to the internet. And that screenshot on the right is one of them. When you go to the IP address that was on the website, which we've hidden for this company's privacy, although the whole world knows that it's there, you are prompted with this login. Not that I tested it, but this login also has no controls around brute force. And you can try to log into that as many times as you want until you're successful. And they do. We see these types of attacks on a lot of client networks when we go in and install, monitoring detection mechanisms. A lot of times we see attackers just trying anything they can. If they can connect to a certain type of port like this, they're just trying various usernames and passwords until they're successful. Eventually they will be, if there's no multi-factor authentication, especially. All right. An external remote service is very similar to the next technique we're going to cover, which is exploit public-facing applications. So this here is where an attacker might take advantage of a weakness in an internet-facing computer, program, or command in order to cause unintended or an unanticipated behavior. This is something that you often see on websites, but can also include databases, standard services like SSH, networking devices, and admin protocols like SNMP. Really, any other application with internet accessible socket. For websites and databases, a really great resource is the OWASP Top 10. Another would be CWE Top 25. These highlight the most common web-based vulnerabilities and things to look out for when creating a website or going and auditing your own. This example here shows the first of the OWASP Top 10. It's an advisory around injection flaws. This can be found in almost any data source. In this example that we'll show here, we see in the name input field that the attacker is trying to ascertain information about the database. Because of faulty code or improper protection, the attack was successful. Well, the knowledge gathering was successful, and the attacker is presented with a response that gives them info as to how the database is structured, and it indicates also that they can manipulate the data that's present. And last but not least, we have trusted relationships. Trusted relationship does have some overlap with a few of the other initial access techniques. We've already given an example of SolarWinds, which kind of falls into this category too. They had a trusted relationship with the orgs that were using their software. But more specifically, this could also be something like the target breach. When Target was attacked, it was attacked through a trusted relationship between their HVAC supplier and Target's internal IT system. That was a very big breach, and it happened because of this trusted relationship with the IT systems commingled with the HVAC guys. And because HVAC company used default passwords on all of the equipment, it was easy access for the attackers, where they then accessed Target's credit card system. In combination with other initial access techniques, they were able to gain pretty much complete access to Target's financial information. That was a very costly breach for Target. All right, now we're going to get into the fun stuff. So, mitigation and detection techniques. So, mitigation is aimed at threat avoidance, while detection techniques, as the name implies, they're processes that you can put in place to see if someone has successfully initiated one of the attack actions against your network. We'll give you a second to look at this here. There's over 20 different mitigation techniques mentioned by MITRE just for these 9 initial access opportunities. And of course, security frameworks like NIST, the CIS-20, despite the name, all have over 100 controls or sub-controls. So, we could definitely spend all day talking about the various ways to mitigate threats. For time's sake, today we will focus on some of the top mitigation and detection techniques that you can employ to receive the highest ROI. By that I mean, we are going to really look at the mitigation techniques that address the most risk for the least cost. First, before diving in, the elephant in the room. Having a risk management practice at all, that's number one. That's over everything else. Just having something in place, someone in place who is responsible for handling cyber risk. You need someone present at your organization who's responsible for that, even if they completely delegate the role to a third party like our company or a virtual CISO. Plenty of MSSPs out there that will handle a lot of the risk for you, but having someone internal who's responsible is key. Okay, now to the more specific mitigations that you're looking at here. I'll be going through mitigation and detection techniques in order of how many initial access techniques they mitigate, as mentioned, as well as cost, to really try to give you a clear view of ROI. And as you can see here, there are a number of controls which address a lot of the different techniques. Phishing, as a good example, is used over 80% of successful attacks, right? So that's an important one to mitigate. Email is the main phishing vector. And so security awareness training, since it not only defends against phishing but other vectors, is, in our opinion, one of the best investments that you can make. So through creating a formal security awareness training program, you can actually reduce the number of phish-prone users by about 50% just within the first few months, 90% within the first year if done right. And that means that overall, because 80% of attacks utilize phishing, so if you reduce 80% of attacks by half, you're eliminating 40% of your overall risk. 72% if you're up into 90% mark. 72% of your overall risk, right? Now, all you should know how much risk you guys have. I looked at the guest list, and I could ascertain that most of you have well over $1 million of inherent risk. It's unaddressed risk, right? Or I'm sorry, that's your inherent risk is the risk that you have without any controls in place. And I'm sure all of you do. But let's take that number of $1 million of risk we're looking just with security awareness training, $400,000 to $700,000 reduction in risk. For the cost, which is really just a couple bucks per employee per month, this is probably by far the best ROI that you can get. Of course, we can't just rely on users not to click on the wrong thing. They will. And so we practice defense in depth at Buchanan. It's a natural companion to security awareness training, and it's called Secure Email Gateway. For a similar price point as security awareness training, we provide a fully managed secure email gateway with integrated sandbox technology and 24/7 monitoring to some of our clients. The goal of this service and technology is, of course, to completely prevent phishing and other malicious emails through to the end user. So even though we're training them not to make mistakes, we're still trying to keep their corporate email clean. One reason to do this and training, even if we stopped 100%, which no technology does, but even if we stopped all of it, and these users are still getting text messages, they're still getting LinkedIn requests, Facebook requests, and so the security awareness training covers a whole bunch of bases, not just corporate email. We actually installed a secure email gateway for one of our newer clients with about 300 employees last week. We already caught over 30 with confirmed malicious attachments. That's about one attachment for every 10 employees in just 5 days. These all actually made it past Microsoft standard mail filtering and were caught by our partner, Fortinet. The next control that can easily be put in place to mitigate a large number of threats is multi-factor authentication, or MFA. MITRE tells us that MFA protects against external remote services and valid accounts, but since valid accounts are used in a very large percentage of attacks, once the attackers gain initial access, they may then pivot or escalate privilege through finding access to other valid accounts. Because of that, this is a very important one. This progress is severely hampered by MFA. I'm sure everyone here has used it on banking websites or even logins to your Robinhood account for Dogecoin. It's the process of having a user validated code, which is sent to them through some secure method. We prefer utilizing a hard token, but it's also commonly done through SMS or email. Although when it comes to email, I would advise against using MFA through email. There's a lot of risk associated with that. Our next mitigation technique bridges the gap between mitigation and detection. This provides protection against actually nearly every initial access technique, because at some point, to solidify their access or do what they're trying to accomplish, the attacker must interact with endpoints. MITRE calls this next mitigation category antivirus and anti-malware. This can actually refer to a few different controls. So, for example, the sandboxing that I mentioned with email security, that can count as antivirus, right? But I am going to specifically speak to endpoint AV, and even more specifically, we'll break that out to only talk about endpoint detection and response technology, EDR. EDR provides antivirus capabilities like legacy AV in terms of signature-based protection against malicious files. So, signature-based detection is when you look at the signature of a program or code. It's usually a hash of a program, and then it tries to determine whether or not it's on a blacklist. Almost 10 years ago, the industry realized that this really wasn't as effective as it needed to be, and realized that signature-based AV was becoming less effective over time. At the end of the day, it's relatively easy for attackers to change their signatures. You can just change a few lines of code. And so the industry added behavioral detection capabilities, and EDR was born. I mentioned MITRE ATT&CK evaluations earlier, and the newest attack eval just came out, and our partner, SentinelOne, came through as a top-performing EDR. This is a screenshot from SentinelOne where they detected a Word file as it loads a DLL with a Visual Basic script. And you could confuse a legacy antivirus by even renaming the VBA script changing a line of code or simply encrypting it, like that example we showed before with base 64, that would really confuse the heck out of most legacy antiviruses. But a good EDR will protect your organization from these types of threats, which utilize living off the land or binaries and scripts techniques, and rollback for short, because it actually looks for behavioral patterns too. Obviously, word loading a DLL is a bit abnormal, so this would create a flag for analysts to go and investigate. Here's another example. So you may not be able to determine that all PowerShell usage is malicious, or your organization may require PowerShell to be used by IT, and so you haven't shut it off for your users, right? But when an analyst looks at this alert here, where you can see the user, Kevin Mitnick, hopefully that name looks familiar, from, this guy's from finance, he's not a hacker, but he's using PowerShell to take a screenshot. The analyst will actually take a look at this machine and realize, why is Kevin from finance using PowerShell to take screenshots? This is probably pretty indicative of malicious behavior, and we would pull that machine and look more deeply to determine whether or not anything malicious is going on. In this case, it is. This is actually part of the MITRE eval that I took this screenshot from, and is part of the attack that was detected. That brings us to another important point. One note with EDR, it does require a lot of interaction in order to see the full value of the product. It will generally create a lot of alerts, and a lot of them will actually be false positives. For a lot of IT teams, that's a major pain. I happen to like it. I like to have alerts around things that might be bad but are probably good, because these days attackers really do use a lot of living off the land techniques, and I mentioned that earlier to define that. Living off the land could be when someone uses a program like Command or PowerShell that exists on almost every Windows device out there. Living on the land meaning a program that's already within your computer, right? So anyway, for to be able to handle all of the alerts that come in, you'll need a team, preferably a qualified security operations center, and around the clock is needed as well, because hackers don't sleep. So for us, while EDR does provide mitigation, it's also one of the three pillars of detection technology, which we've been discussing. And as you can see here, this is kind of our stack, so to speak, when it comes to managed detection and response. We have our security, information, and event management, SIM. We have EDR, endpoint detection and response, and we have threat hunting. We didn't abbreviate that one, but TH. So many others are also starting to call MDR XDR, extended detection and response, but I think that's just marketing fluff. A real MDR program, as far back as I looked at it, involves not only network, not only endpoint, but all of it. I've seen a lot of companies that have different MSSPs looking at network security, another MSSP looking at endpoint security. They don't talk to each other, and at the end of the day, the left hand and the right hand need to talk, and to have a full picture, a full view of security in your network, you need both endpoint and network. So we'll move into the detection category now and actually discuss a SIM. Obviously, there's a whole bunch more mitigation techniques. We just don't have the time to go through all of them, but I hope I touched on the most important ones, or at least the most basic ones, right? So that's for a SIM. Although, a lot of modern SIMs, by the way, do have orchestration capabilities, so there is some mitigation involved too. It's kind of like the difference between an IPS and an IDS. SIMs used to only detect, but now sometimes when they detect, you can build in through SOAR, security orchestration and remediation, you can build in the ability to automatically remediate threats. For example, if a big alert comes in and it's high validity, you can automatically block the IP that it's coming from through APIs between your SIM and your firewall. So a SIM is oftentimes the backbone of a well-tuned SOC. Most other security tools, network devices, log collectors, EDR, right? They all connect and send logs to the SIM, where they're then analyzed, correlated against threat intelligence, and pulled out if malicious activity is suspected. Logins, for example, can be tracked through 365 or your AD server directly. They can be tracked and logged, and then if a rule correlates to the type of behavior that's being seen, it can create an alert. So, for example, there's a rule that out there called, impossible travel. Let's say you log in from Dallas and then you log in from China a few minutes later. Well, unless you've invented some very new technology, that defies the laws of physics. And so that would create an alert, which the team would look into and probably block whoever it is in China that's connecting with your username and password. In order to detect risks before they impact your business, it's definitely best practice to adopt a SIM, partner with a managed security provider who can do it if you don't have the in-house staff or capability. But together with EDR especially, this detection technique will really look at, as this kind of slide shows, right? It will take in alerts from all of your different mitigation tools and provide you that full coverage, that 360 visibility of your network and potential attacks against it. I would say, like EDR, this does require a 24/7 operation to be fully effective. So, if you don't have those capabilities in-house, partner with someone who does. But again, to reiterate one last time, it's probably the best way to detect basically every initial access technique, as well as other techniques throughout the attack kill chain. Okay, last but not least, and this is a fun one that we like here at Buchanan, threat hunting. So there are three main types of threat hunting, and we employ all three here. I'll give you a second to look at the slide. So the first and most basic, most common threat hunting technique is an IOC search. Most companies out there, when they say they do threat hunting, this is what they're doing. And I like to call it advanced Googling. An indicator of compromise, IOC, by the way, is an identifying attribute. Most commonly encountered as like a virus signature or a hash. An IP address would be an IOC. Let's say, an IP address that we know is where the hacker's C2 command and control server is. That IP is now an IOC. Our threat hunters rely on data from our threat intel team, who come up with a list of IOCs, so our threat hunters search through those logs for. This type of hunting does require that you have logging in place and some sort of search mechanism like those built into SIM and EDR, although you can do it with other logging tools that are maybe open source, less intelligent than a SIM or an EDR tool. If you collect logs, you can always kind of go back and look through the logs for IOCs to see if they've if anything in your company has interacted with those IOCs. It does also require some sort of threat intelligence, right? Where you get those IOCs from. So often those are gathered through analyst research, distribution lists, subscription, ISAC, things like that. The next type of threat hunting after IOC is based on data from behavior analysis, like a UBA or an EDR. So MITRE ATT&CK actually is super helpful with this type of hunting. It's really kind of the Bible when it comes to behavioral-based hunting. It helps a lot. We're not looking for signatures, but we're looking for tactics, technologies, or procedures, TTPs, right? So with this approach, our threat hunters come up with common attack scenarios and search for those techniques that are used, analyzing the events that match the parameters. So for example, in the context of initial analysis, we may go in and search for login activity from, we'll pick on China again. Well, look for login activity from China, and our organization has no assets in China. A successful login from that country may, of course, indicate a breach. So what we're doing is going in and looking for an initial access technique in this case. Now, a more advanced example of this type of threat hunting could be to specifically search for, say, T1003, which is MITRE's operating system credential dumping indicator. And we can do that by searching for times that LSAS was read. Last but definitely not least, our third and newest threat hunting technique to cover is based on DFIR, Digital Forensics and Incident Response. The mouthful. DFIR is relying upon volatile memory analysis. An example manual tool to perform memory analysis would be volatility. With volatility, you can inspect a memory dump from an endpoint and take a deep dive into everything running on the machine to determine if it's malicious. Sometimes adversaries leave very little on the actual machine, on the hard drive, to determine if it's malicious. And so this technique is used sometimes, actually, with something like volatility. This is actually used a lot in hindsight because it takes a lot of time, right? It takes hours, actually, with volatility just to go through one computer. However, we found a method that works really well for us where we can hunt through memory on thousands of endpoints per hour. Rather than one endpoint for about 5 hours, we can do thousands of endpoints per hour with this technique. And essentially what we're able to do is scan an entire network and pull any suspicious applications, memory injections, artifacts, etc., in order to determine if they have any malicious capabilities in their code at all. So in contrast to the behavioral piece, in contrast to seeing that a process is injecting code as it does it, with this technique, we're actually able to see if a process even has the ability to inject code into another process, and if it meets some other various signature parameters, such as trying to evade a VM, which may indicate that it's trying to obfuscate itself from a sandbox. When you put those together, the threat score goes up on this particular application, and we look with more scrutiny. I hope that does a good job of summing those up. It does sum up the forensic analysis and then threat hunting as a whole.
All right. Thank you so much, RJ. Well, that does conclude today's webinar. I do want to apologize. I know we had a little bit of audio issues, but I do want to remind you all that you can view this webinar on demand on our on-demand channel on Bright Talk if you need to reference something. We do have a little bit of time left, so I want to dive right into a few questions that came in for you during the presentation, RJ. So you mentioned risk calculation. Do you have any good resources for doing that?
Yeah, I think we could send some out after this. There's a lot out there, right? One of the really neat things in this world of ours in cybersecurity is that there's a lot of really great information sharing. A lot of, like, NIST, for example, there's tons of data on there on how to actually calculate and quantify risk. But a lot of times, this is something that you can do and include, finance, your CFO, include sales, include HR, and ask your various organizations throughout your company what there is to lose if they got hacked, right? If sales couldn't work for a week, what would that mean to your bottom line, right? That's risk, that's cyber risk, because a ransomware attack on average knocks you out for a week. Colonial Pipeline, right? Far more disastrous than most companies when it goes down for a week. But you can use methods like that, but we'll send something out to follow up as well.
Great. Next up, we have, which tools does Buchanan use for threat hunting?
Yeah, so our partner that we use for that, for the one that I was talking about at the end there, would be InfoSight. So we use them for volatile memory analysis. When it comes to other types of threat hunting, so behavioral and log-based searching, that's really relying on our logging sources, which are EDR, I mentioned Sentinel-1, and our SIM, which we use ArmorPoint for SIM with us and most of our customers.
Okay, and last one. Are there any other ways that you have seen initial access compromising a customer's network?
Other ways that we've seen initial access compromising a customer's network. In addition to those 9 ways, no, I think they do a really good job of categorizing that. And there's a lot of things like, let's say an insider threat, right? When you look at what an insider threat is and where the initial access really is, it's a little more murky, right? But in that case, I would say it's a valid account. And so, it still will qualify under some of those 9 that we listed out. Even though it's a bit of a different way of going about it.
Okay, great. All right, thank you so much, RJ. Once again, we do want to thank you all for joining us today and want to reiterate that, after following this webinar, you are able to view it anytime on our on-demand Bright Talk channel to reference all the material that was presented. We do hope it was helpful for you. On the screen, you will see RJ's contact information, and we'll leave that up for a little bit should you want to reach out to him directly with any questions. And with that, we want to thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.